Welcome to our next book review, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Father Conroy, and I'm John Paul Connolly, and today we're going to be having a discussion around some of the themes to emerge from this book. If you can see that, change the lighting a wee bit. It's called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Trueman. Now, Trueman was and is an academic, teaches theology. He currently is working at Grove City College in the US, in Pennsylvania, as a professor of biblical and religious studies. Now, he is an ordained minister, but he's part of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. He's not a Catholic, but a lot of the issues that he talks about in the book relates very much to Christians of any denomination, really, including Catholics. So we felt that it was a good opportunity to perhaps discuss some of the issues to emerge from the book. The reason why Trueman wrote this text is based on a general interest that he's had in his career, his academic career, and through his pastoral work around the concept of the self and the extent to which postmodernism, or if you want to call it modern culture, has had an impact on Christianity, sometimes the marginalisation of Christianity, and what it means to be an individual within such a society. In many ways, the book is looking at this issue of what we call expressive individualism. This idea that it's the individual that's important rather than the wider community or even wider structures like the church and religion. And he goes into a number of different themes in the book. It's quite far-reaching in many ways, but he talks about ideas around social issues, politics, technological changes, and economic developments, which in many ways have been damaging for a Christian perspective of society. And the link that he makes there is to the issue of identity politics. So we've probably all heard to an extent of the rise of identity politics, that you're able to identify yourself in kind of any way you want to. This idea that you're able to categorize yourself in a way that suits your interests. This concept, therefore, of identity is linked to freedom within the book. In other words, the pursuit of individual choice and individuality is how we can characterize the pursuit of freedom. Not necessarily issues to do with metaphysics or Christian values, or even the wider community values. It's about the individual. So that's why the book is called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, self being the key word there. In many ways, Father, the book relates to a number of themes around modern culture. And one of the things that I took from the book was that there's a view here that individuals are in a situation whereby they might feel as if society doesn't give them any degree of accountability over themselves, and that you have the right to pursue your individual goals regardless of the wider societal outcomes. What kind of things did you take from the book more generally, Father?
Well, I think that subject that you spoke of there, that topic, that was the central one that I took from it. I don't think it's necessarily all bad, but I think that where we find ourselves is a place where the application of it is not conducive to the search for truth. I think we're in a situation now where, together with individualism, We have divided everything up. So there's no sense of unity in the world anymore. You know, there is truth for people, but it's a personal truth or an individual truth. There's truth of science, there's truth of music, there's truth in food, there's truth in all these different things. And when there's no sense of unity, then I think it's hard for us to find anything, you know, that does hold us accountable. It's hard for us to find anything outside ourselves that can give us a moral criterion for our behaviour. It's like, you know, what was it? Einstein had this search for a universal theory. So already in his time, you know, there was this sense that science and the pursuit of science and the pursuit of science in a way that said that it was the only thing capable of giving truth of who we are, had broken up the unity that once existed, so that people searched for truth through science, but that couldn't give them a truth of who they were in themselves. So Einstein and scientists are still looking, you know, some way to fit together, what is it, those four basic forces of nature. And it's not only that, I think, that has happened to our culture, this modern culture, but we have become individuals in understanding ourselves. You know, we want to decide for ourselves rather than being shaped by external influences. That's what you were talking about with this expressive individualism. But the point for me is that that's not who we are. You know, okay, we understand as we're growing up, we go through adolescence, where we try to understand ourselves as individuals, which is a very painful period for many people. But you know, when you reach a certain level of maturity in adulthood, you're looking for someone else to share your life. When you have a family, when you have children, you understand yourself in a completely new way. And it's a wholesome way. It's a liberating way. It's a freeing way. And although you've got ties and commitments and duties and responsibilities, in a sense, you discover who you actually are as a parent. You know, and I think that's who we are. That our society is sort of saying, this is who you are as an individual. Find yourself as an individual. But there is something within us that is saying, no, I need other people to understand myself. And I can only come to a self-consciousness if I'm in dialogue with other people. So there is inherently in our society, I think, this conflict, this confusion. And I think that is being manifested in so many different ways, where people are at odds with themselves and with others. And that's something that came out from the book for me. Mm-hmm. I think, though, I said it's not all negative, because this, I think what people generally don't understand or don't, you know, haven't realised is that this is something new in society, this desire to understand oneself as an individual without relation to other things. Because if back in, you know, the classical world, people understood themselves in relation to the state, or relation to the polis, the city to which they belonged. The big difference came with Christianity. There's a book by a man called Larry Siedentop who gives the history of this. It's called Inventing the Individual, the Origins of Western Liberalism. And he shows how it was principally St. Paul in this underdevelopment of conscience and personal response to God, and that our modern individualism has developed out of. I think this book that we're talking about, Carl Trueman, he really picks it up with Rousseau. But there's a development before that. And, you know, like nowadays you get a lot of autobiographies. But in the classical world, the autobiographies just didn't exist because people weren't interested, they weren't aware of themselves as individuals the way that we are. What I think where the development from Christianity has gone wrong, and perhaps it's people like Descartes and nominalism and Rousseau, is that it became individualism rather than personalism.
Yes.
And I think what we need to get back to is, well, move away from individuals, which is, to me, divisive, divisive, and back to understanding ourselves as persons. We talk of the right of individuals. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should be talking about the right of persons.
Yeah. I think the other thing as well is that we've seen so many challenges in society which have an impact across persons. So if you think about the pandemic, for instance, it's something that shapes everything. It shapes all of our social activity. It shapes how we see our families, whether we see our families or not, how we do our work, how we interact with others. So there's some social forces at times that come along to remind us that we're not just individuals, we're a community. And it's about how does our thinking and how does the church capitalize on some of that thinking. But just kind of going back to, you know, what you were saying there about some of the key thinkers that perhaps have shaped Carol Trueman's thesis here. You know, one of the dominant thinkers that he talks about is Karl Marx. So the rise of Marxism, so the Communist Manifesto really set a trajectory whereby the dominant economic model was challenged. And that economic model very much promoted the idea of oppression. Yeah. So you mentioned the point that, you know, back in classical times, you know, what we'd really be talking about is the relationship between the individual and state. And you'd be thinking more broadly about your contribution and your relationship to macro structures in society. But when Marxism came along, you know, the idea was that that relationship was oppressive. Yeah. Therefore, the other is the enemy. And so it's almost like the economic model, which cannot be divorced from the politics either, but the economic model really shapes how we view society. So individualism is often promoted via this idea of dialectics, conflict between groups. And in many senses, what we've seen in the book is the result of that. In many ways, like you've mentioned yourself, about individualism being the key. It's not about persons, it's about the individual. But how do you get there? There's got to be some forces that are laid down that push that sentiment. And it's perhaps no, you know, accident that what we're seeing now is an increasing post-Christian society, whereby Christian ideas are marginalised very much within the state, within public policy, which by virtue of that will have an impact on our social life and how we connect to others. Now, obviously, Marx, his economic project, you know, it wasn't particularly successful if you look at the history of the world, but he certainly managed to plant the seeds of thinking about oppression and conflict.
Yeah, I think something that I found interesting in Trueman's presentation of it was that there isn't a single line of thought that has led to individualism in society. Marx was, as you're saying, he was influential, but he was influential amongst, let's say, academics or people who were looking to understand, where the majority of people, I don't think, are academics. They don't read books to try and understand the history, the development of society, or how history has developed. So he puts before us other cultural influences that from, let's say, intellectuals, from poets and authors who have picked up on a certain trend and have developed it. And that's how the majority of people pick up a culture, I suppose, that then exists. So that this oppression idea came out in various different ways amongst poets and artists as something, well, we reject this morality, we reject Christian morality. So what can we find in its place? And that was when Romanticism started to flourish, and this whole notion of, well, let's look at our feelings, let's look at our emotions. They give us the truth of who we are. Taking up as well one of Rousseau's theses, where said, the truth is not out there, the truth is in me. Mm-hmm. He believed that, I suppose, Rousseau believed in the goodness of individuals. So he rejected the whole notion of original sin, the notion that we are broken as people. And he saw only and proposed only that our natural feelings were good and were always to be trusted, which I think anybody with any sense sort of says, maybe not all the time, and that's how I think our society has now taken on that and said, our feelings are good, our emotions are good. That's where we're authentically a human being, and that's what we should trust.
Yeah.
So, I think other people then have come in and developed that, like Freud has come in, and the whole notion of fundamental to our sense of being a human being is our sexuality. Sexuality has become foundational for our identity in the modern society. And I think that has brought with it great problems for people.
Yeah, I think that's also tied into feminist politics as well, and gender politics more generally, actually, and how that connects with sexual identity. I think the other thing as well to say about Marx, I agree with what you're saying about the fact that it's often within the more academic circles that those ideas can be promoted or discussed. At the same time, though, what I would say is that some of those ideas did lay the seeds for things like socialism, which we have seen, as a kind of dominant ideological model in many parts of the world, and it can shape public policy. And in some ways, I always found that to be an interesting paradox, in that, in some ways, this idea of the oppressive structures of society. So you've got the bourgeoisie, the kind of controlling classes, and the proletariat, the kind of working classes, who are jarring together. But at the same time, socialism does promote things like welfare states. The idea of being part of a wider society. So I've always found that to be a kind of interesting dilemma within that line of politics. And in some ways, that kind of has an impact in some ways on the kind of modes of thinking that emerge from this book, which is, it's not just about, as you say, it's not just about Marx. It's about all these different factors and forces which perhaps have allowed us to emphasize individuality and individual goals. He's talked about Rousseau and the kind of idea of the pursuit of freedom. So the pursuit of freedom is, as long as I can achieve the greatest that I can achieve with the gifts that I've got, then that's success, that's happiness. But then that divorces itself in some ways around the satisfaction that can be accrued from, say, for example, a friend or a brother, a sister, offering your support to that person, thinking about their success, doing what you can to help them, not necessarily, well, sometimes at your own expense, actually, because that might be for the greater good, but that's certainly not emphasized within this modern culture.
I think to go back to what you were saying about Marx, that one of the things that he did, because he denied the transcendent aspect of our human nature and limited it to simply, I suppose, the historical development, the necessary historical development, which arose out of this conflict between the classes of people. He both limited our vision of where happiness was to be found to the material, but I think also he put into a lot of people's thinking that inherent to progress is conflict, and that it's necessary, that the only way that we can progress, and its material progression is what we're aiming for with Marx, is is through conflict. And it's almost as if, it's unthinking conflict. It's just you have to destroy things, first of all, to allow something new to develop out of that. And I think that you can see that a lot in our culture as well. I think where people have bought into that idea, and it's just, this previous society that was built up, it has to be destroyed, it has to be smashed. And there's no negotiation with that. And that has come out, I think, a lot in the past few years, where people have just, maybe it's through frustration as well, and with the unhappiness that they're finding in their life, the dissatisfaction that they're finding, but they've sort of said, well, we want change. The only way to achieve this change, according to this model, is to smash what was there before, to have some sort of revolution of overturning, upturning, and to create space for something new to come from this. And I mean, that's...
And do you think that in some ways that's related to some of the developments we've seen recently around things like trying to take down the statues of historical figures who might have represented something, now we might recognise as unpalatable or difficult. And we're not denying that, but this idea of revising the past and revisionism, and do you think that's all kind of tied into some of that line of thinking that you've just described?
I think it might be, yes. I mean, it's hard to, maybe it's hearsay, or, but yes, I think it is, because definitely people are wanting change of something, and there is a rejection of things that they see. And the language that they are using is his language. It's Marx's language. It's other philosophers, thinkers who are in that same line of thought. And they're using that language to talk about smashing things, and to change what is oppressing them, so that they can have this freedom. It's not only Marx. It's not only Marx's thought. There's other things as well that they've taken to, I suppose, just to try and express what they're feeling and what they want.
Yeah, and I suppose that takes you in a direction of, if you're always focused on your feelings, there's so many factors that can change how we feel. It could be the day you're having, it could be the job you have, it could be the relationship you're in. And it's not a constant. It's up and down. It's up and down.
Yeah.
Where's the safety in that?
Yeah.
It's so chaotic.
Yeah, and where's the identity in it as well? I mean, what you feel today is who you are. I might feel differently tomorrow. So tomorrow I'll be someone else. And, we are in this fluid society. People, I think, are, they can't look to the future, and they can't look to the past. There's this whole thing, live in the present, live for today, which is fine up to a point, but, really, we need to have the past in which to have some sort of foundation, so that we can go forward into the future with some sort of continuity. The only thing is that people are rejecting tradition. They're rejecting that whole sense of belonging to some tradition as being useful for them, because it doesn't allow them to express themselves as they are now understanding themselves, in these terms of our emotions and feelings. Otherwise, we'd have to criticize ourselves. And we're not very good at criticizing ourselves, I think. We're good at criticizing others who don't agree with us. But, that reflection, I think, is becoming rarer and rarer among people.
Yeah, and the whole idea about the concept of the self, it kind of engenders a culture whereby you think you've got the truth and I think I've got the truth. So you may have heard of people talk about, that they speak to their truth, and they go about their life. And if we've all got truths, then it's designed to be conflictual.
Yeah.
It's also a space for radicalism as well, because where do you draw the line?
Yeah. Well, that's the whole thing of anarchism, isn't it? That there is no every structure is oppressive, so let's get rid of it all, and so that we can live our freedom, our personal freedom.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's getting to the stage where it's maybe even a generation or so ago, people looked on freedom, the individual's freedom, saying, yes, well, your limits are to other people's freedom.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's even being challenged now. And there's sort of people are getting to the point of saying, you know, well, your freedom's wrong because it's impinging on my freedom. Mm-hmm. So there's other people aren't being considered. It's almost as if it's a new kind of totalitarianism that's coming out, of individual totalitarianism. We're all becoming our little state, our little private world. And anybody that comes in to that, and you know, they're in the wrong. And I think, I mean, that we're not at the stage yet of the violence that we can see in America, you know, where a lot of that violence, you think, well, you know, why are they doing that? And it's simply because, you know, the people are not agreeing with me. People are doing things I don't like. And a lot of our programs, television or films, they're responding to that same thing with violence, teaching us that violence is an answer to stop people impinging on my freedom. Now, we're still at the stage of people saying, you know, that these are the bad people and we're just defending nice people. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a small stage, a small step to then saying, no, they're bad people because they're not letting me do what I want.
Yeah.
I think there's the whole populist movement, you know, is verging on that.
Absolutely. I don't think we can divorce this from populism. I think it's a major factor. And I think it's also has its roots within education, if I'm honest. I mean, you know, as a social scientist at a university, and you know, I've taught at numerous universities, and I'm very much a product of the higher education system. One of the things that I would suggest is that there's a lack of scope for broad thinking. You may have heard of this kind of idea, and it happens more in the US. This idea of not having particular speakers to come along. Normally, those with more conservative views that might provide a counter debate to some of the more left-leaning articulations that some speakers have. And I think that in some ways we're losing something there, in that the debate isn't being had at all.
No.
So the space for conversation and actually the opportunity to find some middle ground, there's no opportunity to have that conversation. And it's became quite toxic within the US. And we can see some of the evidence of that in Britain as well. And it's quite difficult to talk about Christian ideas and Christian values if you are a non-theologian, for instance, or non-Catholic with it. You know, if you're not teaching Catholicism in a university, it can be difficult to talk about these things. And I guess that relates to this idea of the cancel culture as well. It's quite an unforgiving culture, I feel. You know, you can make a mistake. You might say something that could actually be taken wrong. You might not necessarily, the intent might not be there, but if it's taken wrong, say on social media, your career can be over. Yeah. It's that bad. It's severe.
You're not given an opportunity to explain or discuss.
No.
And it comes back, I think, to that again, the violence, that has come out of the Marxist strain, and you know, where it is just something has to be overthrown because it's wrong. So don't enter into any kind of conversation with it. Just get rid of it. I think that's something that goes deep in our human nature, in that whole idea. I think as in Britain, I was glad to see, I don't know where they are with it, that the government's trying to, and Westminster government are trying to introduce some sort of accountability to universities to force them to not to go down that path as in America, but to say you have to allow open debate.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, even within my contract, there's something called academic freedom, whereby it is written in your contract that you do have the opportunity to express what could be regarded as controversial views, as long as they're evidence-based. And, I think, but then again, universities will also want to be popular. They want to generate income. They want to attract students. So there's also that wider context we can't necessarily ignore. So although you might want to provide a counter to this new populist culture, I'm sure university leaders might not be incentivized necessarily to do it. I understand that Westminster, you're right, they are looking at this. Scotland, it's a different setup. So, in terms of who controls the finances for universities, it's obviously the Scottish government. But yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that we're having this conversation at all is an indication of how far things have come with regards to the dominance of a set of ideas and the lack of scope for alternative thoughts to come to the fore. And I think that can be a challenge. It can be a challenge for people who have faith, who have Christian faith, and if they want to be able to express the fact that they believe in God and they pray and it's an important part of their everyday. And what we see now is a greater emphasis on mindfulness. There's an argument to say that mindfulness also promotes the self and individualism.
Yes, yeah, I think it. Yeah, a lot of it, and I think that is a problem for Catholics, for Christians, that our culture has a bigger effect on us than we realise. And even something like mindfulness, which is promoted as being good for us, it's very healthy, but it's closing the door to transcendence. And it is, as you're saying, it's locking us in ourselves, that this is all something that it flows out of us natural as humans, that we can find our completion, we can find our fulfillment in ourselves. Whereas I think the reality is, that we need to go out of ourselves in some way. We need to transcend ourselves. We need to be open to the infinite and all its manifestations. And again, it comes back to what I think I was saying earlier about where we have divided up truth. And when you divide up truth, you lose something, because there's that old saying, the totality is greater than the sum of all its parts. There's something that we are missing in our culture when we don't, in whatever we do, keep ourselves open to the transcendent, to the infinite. We're going wrong somewhere. We're missing something important. And I think Catholics are, and it's very difficult, I think, living in a modern society, not to go down the wrong path, because you can hardly survive now unless you fit in, and it's just so difficult. And I think what this book is important for us, and I think why we're discussing it, is because it makes us aware of what our culture is actually doing and where it's heading. And we need to have that awareness to sort of say, so that we can check ourselves and say, well, am I falling into this same trap? Am I becoming individualistic in my approach to things? Or am I retaining an openness to others, to the infinite, to the transcendent? In whatever I'm doing, do I have this openness to God?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that the Catholic faith has done, and the Catholic Church has done, is never to say that faith is easy. I've never got that impression. The idea that faith that comes easily and doesn't take work. And I think the individualism means that, is it possible that people aren't prepared to work hard for their faith? Does it mean that people become lazier about thinking about things beyond them? And as a Catholic, one of the things that that I try and do in terms of a response to some of these things is not necessarily wear faith on my sleeve in my day-to-day life, which, you know, I'm recording this, so you'd be surprised. But in my day-to-day life, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be the first topic of conversation. But if it comes up, I'm always happy to talk about it. You know, so many of my friends are atheists and don't believe in God. And, you know, and actually what I've found over a period of time is that those that generally reject God just not, you know, easily, just as part of their everyday, they can be quite fascinated in talking to me about faith issues. I don't think there's a lack of interest in a way with regards to metaphysical things and issues of faith and God. I think people are wired for God. That's my honest. Maybe I'm not an optimist, but I do believe that. I think people are wired for God. But I think what's happened is so many economic and political and social forces have kind of snipped that wire a bit. It's kind of snipping away at it. And I think that as Catholics, you know, and obviously I'm in no position to tell people what to do, but I'm just talking about my own experience, is that try and avoid denying God. Don't necessarily wear it on your sleeve, but if it's part of a conversation, be prepared to talk about it. Because one of the things that I've found is, you know, reading about the lives of the saints, you know, we talk about how society now is just, you know, post-Christian, it's very difficult for Catholics. But if you actually read the lives of the saints, the real struggles that many saints had and the oppression and struggles that they had to come through. And I think there's something to take from that, is to say that some of the challenges we're facing are new culturally, but actually the rejection of God and Catholicism is actually not necessarily something that is new. You know, history has its way of going up and down, and I think each generation has to respond to it in different ways.
Yeah, I think that's a very hopeful message that you were giving there, because, you know, you can look at our society and say, well, it's a post-Christian society. And you can wonder, as Catholics, is the faith finished? Is the church going to die out here? But when you look at history, as you were saying, there is a development, and we're part of that development. And I think it's a hopeful thing, because it's not all bad. You know, there is really something good that is in there. And I think what we need to do as Christians, as Catholics, is to take that, what is good in that, and see what it tells us about our faith. You know, and I think one of the big things that has come out of this whole development is the importance of the person. You know, and that what is being asked of us, you know, is this personal relationship with God, that our conscience, you know, it isn't simply a following of something external to us. It's not a you know, sort of submitting to laws, but it's submitting to another person, as you do in any relationship. And that's where you come to a wholeness. Whereas perhaps before, 3 or 4 generations ago, people submitted to the institutions, submitted to the state. That was, you know, that was it. And nowadays, maybe what the person has to find is that sense of duty and responsibility again, that we, to some extent, we've lost. In other words, we find the connections that we have with what is outside ourselves, with other people, with our world, you know, and I think, you know, so what is going on isn't necessarily all bad.
Yes.
And there is something in there that I think will is the way forward for us.
And I was talking there about my kind of day-to-day experience, you know, and kind of talking about faith when the opportunity arises, or even when I'm asked about it. You know, in terms of, I mean, obviously, you've been a priest now since, was it the 80s?
Yeah, 82.
82. And obviously, back then, these types of questions around identity politics, they weren't really around in the early 80s. And how does the church kind of keep up with it and respond to it, even at a kind of a pastoral level? I mean, I'm not saying that you come across these issues on a day-to-day basis, but, you know, if priests or even church leaders are asked to kind of respond to some of the challenges that are out there on things like, you know, postmodernism, kind of gender identity issues and so on, is there something that has to be added to the education, if you like, of the church to keep up with some of these things, or do you think these things talk to more fundamental questions that are always part and parcel of people's faith journey?
I would say both. I think they do speak to more fundamental things, and perhaps not, you know, maybe it's not such a big difference of what people have always been grappling with, which is, you know, I suppose the question of how do we fit into this world? But that's also a very practical thing. You know, so the church can always say, well, what was the old penny catechism of, you know, years ago used to say, God made me to know him, love him, and serve him in this world, be happy with him forever in the next. And that hasn't changed. You know, it's still about knowing and loving God in this world and the hope of the future. How we express that has changed. That language of the old penny catechism, people maybe, what's that about? No, but it's still about a personal relationship. And that is knowing, loving, and, you know, yes, it is about serving other people, because you do serve the people you love. You look after them, you care for them. So it's those things, it's just the language has changed. But I think, how do you love people in this modern age where they're dealing with other things? Like, you know, back in the 60s, back in the 70s, back in the 80s, this thing called transhumanism, where, you know, people are getting connected to artificial intelligence, was unheard of. And in some way it's a good thing, but is it the future for humanity? You know, is it just to bring us back to allow us to do things that perhaps accidents or violence have stopped people being able to do? Or is it something to enhance humanity? Now, I think those are practical questions, because they're also about gender identity. You know, the church is both, the old saying is, the church is both mater et magistra, mother and teacher. So you have to love the people, but you also have to help them see, well, this is the truth of who we are as human beings. And sometimes that people are, you know, they're not going to accept your view of how things are. But you have to find a way of sort of saying, well, this is what we think, this is what we hope, this is what we believe, and this is how we think we come to the happiness that we're looking for, that we're all looking for. You know, now people are saying it's about this personal fulfillment. Thomas Aquinas said it's all about happiness. So it hasn't changed. It's just how we get there and what that actually means. What is our happiness? You know, is it that sense of being free to be who I am today, tomorrow, next day? Or is there something, is it more of a journey and a growth process that we're on, rather than, you know, changing every time, every day? There is nothing to look forward to.
I think it's quite a neat way of thinking about it, because the previous book reviews we did, you know, the Moriac book on What I Believe and C.S. Lewis's book on Mere Christianity, both of those previous texts that we reviewed talked about this issue of happiness and what it means to be happy in this world, and some of the issues around that. But this book kind of goes into more depth about some of the forces, the kind of modern cultural forces that kind of shape us in a direction whereby, you know, faith issues are being more marginalised. But what you've said there, Father, about what we hope and what we believe, in some ways that's an optimistic way of kind of thinking about this as we kind of wrap this up, is to say, well, surely that's a call to evangelization. It's a call to let people know what they don't know. What I sense is there's a lot of people out there that don't know what they don't know. They don't
Yeah.
understand what Christianity means. They don't understand what it means to be a Catholic. They don't understand how it can actually have an impact on your everyday. It's obviously the Mass is a very important part of the Catholic faith and the Catholic life. But there's lots of things that happen between Mass, you know, about how you conduct yourself, how you pray, how you interact with your family and friends. So I think there's something more to be said about what it means to be a Catholic in this modern era, and in some ways, if I may say, how it can actually help your general quality of life. I'm not saying that things like mindfulness and things don't have a role. I'm sure there's others out there that do it and find it very useful for them. But it's actually about thinking, well, why not try other things as well? Why not think about being part of a prayer group, even reading the life of the saints and so on, to place your struggle and place your suffering within a wider context. And perhaps that's the door that can help be open towards the Lord and God and faith. So for me, I think that's probably my conclusion. Father, have you got any final comments before we conclude here?
Just I think, yeah, I agree with everything you were saying there, that don't get despondent about our world. And it is, we've got something joyful and hopeful to share with people. We've got something that can make our world a better place. We've got something that can make people's lives better. As you've said earlier, it's not always an easy thing. The first few steps aren't always easy. It's almost like you're having to break through a mist of darkness, but it's well worth it.
Yes. Well, thank you, Father, for your time today, and thanks for those who are listening. If you've got any questions at all, you can always get in touch with us to perhaps discuss this book more, or even ask us any further questions. You can get in touch via our Facebook site, which is Faith Living, and we also do have our own YouTube channel for Faith Living, the new evangelization group of the Archdiocese of Glasgow. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.